Okay, so we can start anytime.
7 minutes, 42 seconds. Okay, so I think we'll come back together for our first afternoon panel. I'm Beth Platty. I'm at Valparaiso University and have been involved in the Coptic SCRIPTORIUM project for a couple years now. And it is my pleasure to reintroduce, I guess, our first speakers today, Amir Zeldis, and then should I introduce you now, Becky? Okay, and then also Becky Krawick, who are going to be talking about current possibilities and future directions in Coptic SCRIPTORIUM. And so we'll listen to them and then have some time for questions. And again, we'll have a general discussion at the end of the panel today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are today, partly from a historical perspective of how we got here, what we've been doing for the past 2 years, and also kind of setting up what we're interested in doing in the future. So for those of you who don't know the, as we say in German, Entstehungsgeschichte, the history of the creation of this project, I met Harry Schroeder in 2012 at an NEH Summer Institute on Text in the Digital Age at Tufts. And we pretty quickly realized that there were things that could be done that have not been done for Coptic, and that this would be an interesting problem to work on together. And we subsequently applied for the NEH grant that we got, and which we've also applied to an extent, and started working on putting Coptic texts online in a similar way to what we'd seen for Greek and Latin. So for many things, kind of Perseus was our role model in our heads, that we wanted to have searchable texts, that we wanted to not only talk about metadata and indexing larger collections of texts, but also really to have access to the individual word level, to be able to do statistics and quantitative studies on Coptic in a way that would benefit across disciplines. So I am a linguist by training. What I'm interested in is primarily the stuff of how the language is used. And there are religious historians of religion, who are interested in the religious aspects of the text, and church history of the church, in material history, and the world of the Mediterranean in the first millennium. So very different points of interest. Since then, we have grown to include a lot of people. I'm hoping this is a representative sample of some of the main people working on the project, but probably there are a lot more that I'm not mentioning. I primarily focus on people who have contributed real annotated data to the project, which are these, including Rebecca Krawick, who's presenting with me. An advisory board with really lots of useful advice on best practices and how to encode Coptic texts. And people have been very generous with making their resources available to us in a digital raw format. And I'd like to especially thank Tito Orlandi for making the CMCL resources open to us in a format of this sort. And I'd like to think that we've come quite a long way from 2012. So there'll be my perspective, and later Rebecca will give you her perspective on the things that have changed from when we started. But the situation back in 2012 was that if you wanted to know how common some construction is in Semitic Coptic, you didn't know. You had no corpora for which you had, I mean, there were some digitization projects to be sure, but you could not get the answer how many words are in a text from Project X. That was not something you could normalize to. You could get maybe attestations, find the instances where such a thing was used. But there were no, what I'll call large-scale, publicly available electronic corpora in the sense that linguists mean, that you don't just have maybe a facsimile that is online or a PDF of some edition, which may or may not be supposed to be online, but really a machine actionable access to each and every word. There was no agreement on a part of speech tagging schema. I'd like to say that still does not exist. We've seen very many different standards and ideas about what are the parts of speech for Coptic. I'll talk about that a little bit. And with the exception of the very famous Le Matiseur, there were basically no computational linguistics tools for Coptic. So for many tasks, if you didn't have in mind to do the very specific thing that a project had generated software for, there were no general solutions for taking Coptic text and making it into a searchable format where each part of the Coptic sentence or word was assigned a certain category. So with the help of many of the people present, we've built some resources. We've built the Coptic corpora that you can get online and download in a variety of formats. We've devised annotation guidelines for how to segment a Coptic text into its smallest units and assign the meaningful categories. We've produced tools for building the annotated corpora, from starting with digitized text. So we haven't really gotten into OCR yet at all, which is something I'm very interested in learning more about. And developing software to search through the text and visualize them in appropriate ways. All of what we produce is available under an open license, if it is at all in our power to influence, generally CC BY for the texts, and Apache 2.0 license for the software. And one of the first things that we started working on was segmentation of Coptic text, and we've been advancing. So if anybody here has had any experience with computational linguistics, you'll know that it's relatively easy to get solutions that perform at 80% of a task or 90% of a task. But 80% accuracy on something means that every fifth instance is wrong. So every fifth word has a mistake. That's basically unusable. Things start to be usable when you reach the kind of mid-90s, so that every 20th word of whatever you're doing is wrong. And the problem specifically with segmentation is that it influences everything you do after that. If you missegmented a Coptic bound group, then there is no chance to get the part of speech right. You're done. That is an error that will carry over. So it's very, very crucial to improve these tools. And if you have experience working on natural language processing, you'll know every one of these percentage points above 94, 95 costs you blood. It becomes progressively more difficult to get 0.1% better, a little bit better. And we've been making periodic releases of our tools as they've improved. So this is kind of the situation right now for text in good orthography within the domain that the tools have been developed for and so on. If you move to something like documentary papyri, with which we have very cursory experience right now, things degrade substantially. So this is kind of information for a good text like this. And you see here, for those of you who are less familiar with Coptic, but I guess it's similar for many languages of the ancient Near East, you have the bound groups, you have components of these bound groups. So this is something like sophos, Greek sophos, the article p is written together, and the task is to segment that. And Coptic manuscripts, of course, don't come with spaces at all. So the things that we consider to be bound groups, colored here in different colors from this manuscript, are something that the transcriber has to distinguish while a text is being digitized. So these are all substantial challenges. The next thing we worked on once we had some sort of working segmentation of the text was part of speech tagging, because it is a way of abstracting kind of grammatical patterns above and beyond the specific form that a word might have. So part of that process is normalizing, because you want your trained tools to recognize a verb like sortem in one form of spelling, but if somebody, for some whatever reason, spelled it in an aberrant way, you want your tools to be able to deal with that. And once that had gotten to a point where the carried over mistakes were few enough, we started working on tagging with initially quite bad results. You can see here the progress of our project in months and where we are right now. So you're also seeing the shape of the curve, which is getting progressively flatter, because it becomes more and more difficult to leverage the information that you have. So this is a part of speech tagger based on about 30,000 word units of manually corrected and checked Coptic word forms, if you will, normalized units. And they are being assigned one of 46 parts of speech that we've designated from basically Layton's grammar. So the part of speech tags that follows very closely the grammar of Bentley Layton. And the idea is to use these things to make fully searchable corpora, also for resources where we're not in a position to check every word manually. So for instance, for the New Testament, which we recently made publicly available, we took the Sahidica version from the Packard CD and kind of tried to pass all the different tools this data and make it accessible in a uniform way. And this has about, according to the automatic segmentation, 220,000 words. But in any case, it's a reproducible resource that you can go back to, you can compare, you can produce research results with it and say, well, I base my statement on this resource that you can download here under an open license. So this resource is entirely segmented by the computer and entirely tagged by the computer for part of speech. And in a few slides, I'll be showing you some things that you can do with that and what that can be used for. So a quick overview of our tag set. We have two tag sets. One is very coarse-grained and has only 23 tags. This is used, or especially useful for documentary material, we found. So accuracy on that tag set degrades much less drastically because we're not asking the tagger to distinguish different types of pronouns. There's just one category for the pronouns. Not asking to distinguish different types of auxiliaries, just something is an auxiliary or isn't. Not asking to disambiguate the converters in Coptic, just one category for some sort of converter. In the fine-grained tag set, we do all of these distinctions up to the most fine-grained that we could realistically expect to do. So we have different types of verb forms for the suffixally inflected verboids, for imperative verb forms like ari, for the stative like o, and so on. We distinguish the different types of pronouns, from the independent ones to the dependent pronouns in subject and object position. the different converters, the different auxiliaries, and we also distinguish proper and common nouns. And this all amounts to having at least 46 different tags. And we also have a guidelines document that you can get online on how to assign these tags and how to distinguish between ambiguous cases. We recently published a paper, or actually it's not been published yet, it's been accepted. I think there is no online version of it yet.
No.
There will soon be an online version of a paper describing inter-annotator agreement on this. So we did compared ratings on doing the same text to people separately, namely the two of us, and checked where we disagreed and wrote a little bit about when we disagreed and why, so to evaluate the quality of the guidelines. And this really lets you have an idea of what you are searching when you are using one of these corpora. To access the corpora, we use a search engine called ANIS that was actually developed in a completely different project for linguistic corpora in general. And it's been an interesting challenge, but also a big opportunity to adapt the software to a new scenario. So rather than devise brand new tools for Coptic, we generally took tagging tools that were available for other languages, technologies for search and visualization that we had in other projects, and kind of tried to synergize and capitalize on the fact that other people are working on the same infrastructure. So ANIS is being developed concurrently in a lot of places, including here, and it's being used for very many other languages. Parts of the capabilities of the system are making different types of visualizations available for the same data. So there's one underlying data model from which these different types of information are derived, such as a near representation of what the manuscript text looked like, where the columns were, what letters were rendered in what form. And these are also searchable. So it's not just a nice rendition. There are annotations that correspond to these. Not sure if this example has any of them. It's also pretty small. But yeah, here, this letter has been rendered as red and tall, and that is searchable. So you can find letters that are red and tall and count them. And there's also an interlinear kind of view with the translation for every sentence and the part of speech superimposed on top of each unit in the bound groups, so that you can really search and visualize whatever you're interested in. In terms of corpora, we focused initially on the Apophthegmata Patrum, which is a text that interests me, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and the works of Shenouda, which were a primary interest of Carrie's, also some of our collaborators. Currently, we have some 15 apophthegms with 4 more that are being proofread right now. We have 3 texts by Shenouda, Abraham our father, Not Because the Fox Barks, and Cephalus 422. We have 2 of the letters of Besa that Frederick also mentioned, and right now those are To Thieving Nuns and the letter to Afthonia, which are very interesting. And some New Testament texts. So there's been manually redacted versions of the Gospel of Mark and 1 Corinthians, and we have the entire New Testament done automatically. I should take out the by request because we've actually put it online, so not by request, anybody can have it. And we're currently working on the documentary papyri that we got from papyri.info from the Uke collection, and these are very interesting because they offer completely different challenges. And the trick is to get them all into the same system so that you can do comparative work, comparing the quantities, comparing the behavior of the grammar, at least from my perspective, I'm interested in the grammar. And that's only possible if they're done up in the same schema. Some things that we're still interested in doing and have only got prototypes for are parallel alignment for Greek and Coptic. So this is actually surprisingly not Bible. This is the Apophthegmata Patrum, because most of them are available also in Greek, and presumably at least most of the Coptic text was actually translated from the Greek. But it's not a one-to-one match, and there are also documents that are only available in one of the languages. Additionally, we have work on syntactic analysis, so getting a tree bank of Coptic up would be something I'm very interested in. Lemmatization is something we're working on right now. So far, we've only been normalizing, but we're interested in getting dictionary entries for every word so that we can link up to electronic resources. Entity annotation would be something we'd love to work on, so identification of people and places in the text in an automated way. And some other things that we might talk about tomorrow. Another move forward that's very important to us is having reproducible, citable resources. So we have a prototype for a system that will hopefully go up before long for getting citation URLs or URNs that are for individual resources, which will be persistent and interoperable with some other initiatives. So Lagos or I don't know, did we have something with Trismegistos? Or we wanted to have some. So this is something.
Yeah.
This is still a work in progress, and we are very, very interested in getting maximal compatibility with other citation forms of the same works. And another thing we are interested in getting into is collaborative online annotation. So having some sort of online interface so people can also annotate collaboratively at the same time. And needless to say, we'd like to get new corpora. So we're starting work on getting some hagiography in. There will be more Shanuda that is in the works, partly by Becky, more apophthegms, and anything else that people in this room would like to see online and are willing to contribute their text to. So part of the idea behind this project was that a lot of people have some text lying around on their hard disk from their dissertation or whatnot that they transcribe themselves, to which they have the intellectual copyright in terms of transcription, and the manuscripts themselves have no copyright. And any of such people who would be interested in putting these things online have that right and could absolutely do that. So part of the service that we offer is to give you the technical support if you have such a text and would like to see it done up in the same architecture. We take responsibility for that. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show was a couple of applications of what you can do with the corpora. One thing that you can do is investigate Coptic grammar, kind of qualitatively and quantitatively. This will be my part, and then Becky will talk more about the text contents and kind of the style used by certain authors, which are more philological applications and also historical and religious studies. So for linguistics, I presented a paper last month at NACOL here at the North American Conference for Afroasiatic Linguistics, and I talked a little bit about some qualitative claims made by Green and Rentges in their article about relative aspect, in which they compared Coptic to Hausa typologically. And part of the argument was based on the fact that so-called WH phrases were had a certain interaction with what is known as the focalizing conversion in Coptic. So according to their theory, in Coptic, there are no such sentences as "you did it how," with a focalized how not being moved to "how did you do it" in the beginning of the sentence. And conversely, you were prohibited from using the focalizing conversion if you preponed the pronoun. So you can ask, how is it that you did it? Okay, you can either use the focalizing conversion and not put the how at the beginning, or you're not allowed to use it at all. That was their claim. And it had implications for theoretical linguistics because they were comparing it to Hausa, which supposedly has the exact opposite behavior. And they were postulating some sort of link between these facts, because in Hausa, supposedly you have to use something like the vocalizing converter if you put the pronoun at the beginning and not vice versa. So this was kind of interesting. And this was based on intuitions, which for Coptic are very problematic because there are no native speakers. It was based on reading a lot of Coptic and thinking that's not how you say it in Coptic. It is very true that it's not how you say it in Coptic. It's a rare construction. In the 32,000 words that we have of manually curated text, I have only 3 examples that contradict this, 2 of the one condition and 1 of the other condition. But if you work at all on corpora and linguistics, you know that 32,000 words, if you were working on English, is a pitifully small sample. Something that you can find in 30,000 words is not really rare. Of course, the other option is the preferred Coptic way of saying it. But you can see some counterexamples here. So, in how many trials was he tempted? Or rather, he was tempted in how many trials? So without putting the how early. And vice versa, how will we be able to say the O, where you have the preposed how and still the focalizing converter here? Right. So these things are supposed to be ruled out for Coptic, but they occur. They're rare. They're not the usual way of saying it. The second thing I had to look at was some quantitative phenomena. So this is the so-called optional preterite copula. So in Coptic, you can say in the kind of preterite imperfect semantics, they were praying, neushlel, but you can also say neushlel pe with the copula, which translates roughly, it's they were praying, or rather, they were praying is. And this pe is notoriously optional. Nobody knows its distribution. Leighton himself says it's optional. The conditions for its distribution are unknown. I had to look how this distributes, and I discovered that it's particularly rare in the Bible. So it's much less frequent in the Bible, but then still relatively frequent in counterfactuals. And it's most frequent in Shanuda, and somewhat more frequent than in the Bible in the Apophthegma of Patron. And Shanuda's texts are sermons to be read to an audience. They're meant to inflame the audience, get them very excited. And I was thinking this shows that the copula may have been a more colloquial construction. And another thing that I'd like to do is look at especially the apophthegms and find out whether the cases where this happens are in direct speech or are they in the narrative, because it would be interesting to see if this was really a spoken phenomenon. So it might be that it's a colloquial phenomenon. There also seems to be a higher proportion in the counterfactuals than in the indicatives. So these are all things to look at. With that, I pass the wand to
Thank you. So Amir has taken us back to 2012 and the beginnings of the project that has turned into Coptic SCRIPTORIUM. My task this afternoon is to explain the ways in which I have used this project to advance my understanding of monastic history, specifically, of course, the White Monastery in Upper Egypt. That is, my example does not pertain to computational linguistics, but rather to my work as a religious studies scholar and historian. Right? So I'm not actually going to talk about what I've been doing on the project as an editor and annotator, but how once the corpora was up and searchable, how I've used it for my research since then. Okay, for this, I would like to go further back in the looking back portion looking back portion of the talk to 1994-95, when I was working on my dissertation at Yale University. And Shinitian studies was in its early stages. Stephen Emmel had just completed his dissertation at Yale, reconstructing Shenouda's literary corpus. Right? And for the reasons noted on this slide, this is where things stood. At the time, and working on my dissertation, I was translating a text by Shenouda entitled Abraham Our Father, a work which subsequently was one of the first to appear on Coptic SCRIPTORIUM. Under the direction of my advisor, Bentley Layton, I spent long hours transcribing Coptic, both from a published edition and from the unpublished manuscripts for the ending of this letter, which were subsequently published in an article by Dwight Young. Even with such a low-tech approach, right, because Bentley had me diagram, right, so that's why I was transcribing, because he wanted me to break down the sentences into various structures. Even with such a low-tech approach, it was clear that Shenouda repeated particular words and phrases to create a rhetorically complex argument that was meant to define monastic terms. For example, what was proper monastic labor? Who was capable and incapable of doing this labor? How did this concept join the monastery to the biblical past? The story begun with Abraham and continued with God's help, a key phrase that repeats throughout the letter, through the generations of Israel to the prophets, to the apostles, and finally to the monastery in the desert of Egypt under Shenouda's direction. To try to grasp the means by which Shenouda created his argument, Bentley had me diagram the Coptic to try to visualize these structures of language. I was able, through this work, to create an argument about this letter as part of my overall investigation of women's lives in the White Monastery, which subsequently became my book, Women in the White Monastery, Shenouda and the Women of the White Monastery. Namely, Shenouda in this letter created a monastic family wherein monastic activity became the new parenthood, replacing the labor of having children, and he used biblical figures to substantiate this argument. Finally, I was able to note that there were competing groups in the monastery who had a different view of the relationship between family and monastery than Shenouda did, and that part of that debate focused on a specific passage from Isaiah. Let me fast forward to today. I still have the sheets. I took pictures of them. Say, dug them out of a file folder. Oh, okay, I'm not going to know what's happening here. So we're going to let Amir take over the slides. Thank you. Let me fast forward to today. One more. Yep. And there we go. With Abraham as with this letter as part of Coptic SCRIPTORIUM, we can, using the ANA search tool that Amir has already talked about, produce much more efficiently the visualizations that I was attempting 20 years ago. Further, as is evident, the visualizations themselves are more deeply layered. More crucially for me, right, the searches locate separate points in the letter and so create more connections than I was able to see or realize when working on paper and by hand. So I've returned to an examination of Abraham Our Father for an anticipated article that uses these deeper layers of understanding. Specifically, my paper focuses on how Shenouda cites his sources in this letter. Drawing on Janet Timby's work on scriptural and apocryphal citations in Shenouda's discourses, I looked for various markers, both of Shenouda's allusions to scripture, this is, of course, according to scripture, and specific citations of it. I did 3 searches in quick succession for the word scripture, for the term written, to find as it is written, and simply for the marker jet to be sure I located all quotations because some are named and some are unnamed. By doing all three searches, one can see when Shenouda refers to the general authority of Scripture and when he cites a specific passage. I would argue that this shows the variety of ways he can use Scripture rhetorically and how he can assert his authority with relationship to Scripture. Moreover, a layered visualization, which may or may not be the next slide. I'm not quite sure where we are. There we go. As this string of quotations shows how he moves from quotation to quotation, including some unidentified texts. A fair amount of recent scholarship on Shenouda has been concerned with his use of written sources. Having access to this sort of data to analyze this particular letter and how he uses sources within it will advance our understanding of this rather complex question. Further, because the letter itself is so rhetorically complex, each search produces connections to central terms for his argument, which then can be searched, right, and connected to the work that you have just done. Thus, within the layers, within the searches for Scripture, there are links between that term and other terms that are part of Shenouda's argument. These reveal first that instruction of Scripture is clearly one of the areas of contestation for monastic labor. And second, that Scripture is the source of divine inheritance. These search visualizations make clearer how Shenouda positions scriptural allusion and citation within his argument to create a scripturally based monasticism over and against alternative readings and so alternative forms of monasticism. Finally, such a database of corpora is particularly useful, as I think Amir has already been making clear, because it provides us with more evidence to support various assertions we scholars of the White Monastery tend to make. Let me describe just briefly two such assertions. First, in this side, we can see that Shenouda strings together several quotations. This is important because his successor, Besa, for whom there are also two letters in Coptic SCRIPTORIUM, is often viewed as an inferior writer because of his own tendency to create these quotation sequences. I think I myself may have described him that way in a paper. While we still only have a few examples, eventually Coptic SCRIPTORIUM will allow us to compare within the surviving fragments the frequency of each author to use this technique, and will further allow us to ask whether such a technique serves particular rhetorical purposes within the letter, as I'm going to argue that I think it does at this particular point in Abraham. Second, I have explained that using Coptic SCRIPTORIUM to ask specific questions about the appearance of certain terms recreates, but more deeply, the sort of analysis I did on paper 20 years ago. But it also brings to the fore a key difference that in writing this paper, I had some difficult articulating, so I'm going to do my best here. Earlier, my understanding of Abraham, our father, created for me what I would describe as a sense of his argument. And again, I think this is what Amir is saying. It was sort of a gut reaction, right? Having read the letter several times, right? And so in preparing this paper, I went back and reviewed my book. And while I very thankfully think I was right, and that my argument holds, I was also very much struck, having now done this very detailed analysis, how general it is. Right? There's not a huge amount of philology. Right? I'm drawing conclusions, sort of broad conclusions about the arguments and their implications. Right? There's no section, for example, on the use of graphe in Abraham, right? Something like that one might expect. And in moving forward in that, of course, I have to be very careful about making sure I do not ascribe too much intentionality to the author in word choice, because we are theoretically sophisticated in those ways. But Coptic SCRIPTORIUM and the textual investigations it provides leads to a depth of understanding of how Shenouda was creating a monastic language for his monastery. It leads to a visualization of different citation techniques, which within this letter allow him to create a stronger connection between his scriptural interpretation than that of his opponents. It shows that Shenouda was not just creating a monastic family, but that part of that construction included a contestation of the monastic authority to interpret scripture. In this letter, Shenouda places himself in the role of the correct heir to the biblical and monastic fathers because he understands scripture correctly and so teaches a monasticism that is the continuation of Israel. Just as God chose Isaac over Ishmael to be heir to Abraham, So too, Shenouda's monastic family is God's choice over one where eunuchs and virgins are valued over sons and daughters. These insights that extend our understanding of the establishment and development of the White Monastery have all been made possible by Coptic SCRIPTORIUM. Thank you.
I think we had a wrap-up slide, but in the interest of time, we'll just proceed directly into.
And if you guys would be happy to field your question. Yeah, just a little bit.
Very, very briefly. Quick questions?
Maybe I hold this for later conversations, Becky, but I'm very interested in your question about the use of the formula of scripture or whatever, and whether rhetorically this is potentially signaling and quoting scripture. Because there's a very rich literature in Pauline studies about Paul's use of scripture, where often he just, and then we put, is it an allusion, is it a quotation, is it, you know.
Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying, because of course what I did was when I ran scripture through and I focused in on the times that he was saying according to scripture, because of the sorts of screens that Amir had, you have the search result on the screen. You then see exactly what's around it, right? And you can see whether or not it's followed by a quotation. So I sat there and counted. I sat there and counted, okay, how many times that phrase was occurring and how many times it is then linked with a specific quotation, and it's less than half.
What about the other way around? When you have a quotation without the phrase, would you be able to find it?
Yes, you would be able to find that. I probably know that. I just don't have the numbers on me, but that's almost precisely what you're asking is almost precisely what I was trying to pay attention to within the structure of this one letter. And then, you know, in 2024, when we have all of Shenouda up there, we can, not really live stream. Yes, that would be almost exactly the question at stake.
With linking data, is there a plan to incorporate variant readings into the analysis so that you can search variances in text?
You mean of two witnesses of the same text?
Right. Yeah.
So yes, we are actually currently engaged in a very active debate on the best data structure approach to take to that. I think we've been reaching a consensus.
We'll see tomorrow.
We'll see tomorrow.
That's on the topic.
It's on the topic. There's a suggestion that feels workable. So yeah, definitely on the agenda. Yes.
Yeah, for something like Abraham, one of the earliest things that wasn't an issue because we don't have double witnesses.
We do.
We
We have a
won
couple,
little
but
bit
it's
at
not
the end,
been,
but
you
it
know.
wasn't huge. So, the other thing, this was on one of my slides that I went through so quickly that I'll just note, and it's also something on the agenda for tomorrow, is that when you use ANIS, it's going to search the letter. It's going to search the manuscripts in the order of the name of the manuscript. Which is a very technical Shenouda thing. So we're working to also be able to set it up so that you search the letter in order, reconstructed in order, rather than doing the YA fragments and then the ZH fragments, and all of a sudden you're at the beginning of the letter again and you don't know why.
I think we should probably
Yeah,
get
thank you.
some here. And Paul, I believe,
Thank
is
all of
joining
you
us
for-
remotely.
Yeah.
So-
So you come up and introduce them, and I'll try to
Okay.
set
Okay.
this
So
up.
we're gonna get connected, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
We have a minute.
Paul, can you hear me?
I think we're gonna be starting.
Yeah, I can hear you well. Can you all hear me?
It sounds like
we
we're
haven't
live.
hooked you up yet, so what,
It's
just
gonna
give us
get
one
much
sec.
better in a second.
What is that?
That's the microphone.
Oh, we
The
do have
audio-
the
And
microphone.
the audio is going to get, yeah, I have a funny story to tell about that. And the microphone
We need the audio jack.
channels the audio jack as well.
Oh, okay, great. We don't have to Hold on, just a sec. We're still getting you up here.
Sure, take your time. happily ensconced in my office.
Excellent. And we, put in lots of buffer time into today. So
So try to get the screen to work. I'll try to get the audio.
hopefully we
Say
don't.
something.
Okay, excellent. So
I need some-
hold on a second. We're for some reason, okay, hold on a minute. He's talking, but it's just still just coming out of my computer. Hold on, I'm working on the screen share.
Okay,
You're on my laptop, but you're not on the, there's-
your course comes
there we
first.
are. No, we're good, we're good, we're good. Okay. And so we've got kind of a small screen.
Okay.
Your slides are small. I don't know how to make that. Wait, let me see. Maybe I can make it
Oh,
bigger.
I'm about to, let's see, if I start the slideshow, maybe.
Is there USB stuff installing?
I don't know what you mean.
Like when you connect the new USB device, or something like, okay, it's USB device.
Nothing came up.
Is the slide a little bit larger now?
Not really. No.
Well, maybe.
Hold
should
on,
I-
hold on a
should I
second.
Send you the slide, maybe that might be
Do I need to have, hold on, let me see what happens if I do entire screen. No, that's not changing my end. Try, when you are in Hangouts and you do screen share, try sharing your entire screen. Is that what it's doing? Oh, it's
look at
coming.
that.
Yay, we got the audio to work.
Hang on, it's super weak.
Oh,
Yay! Okay,
he's a dominating.
hold on a second. We gotta turn up the volume.
On this machine. Okay,
That's
say
as
something,
it goes.
Paul.
Okay, can you hear me?
That's
Yay!
good.
Okay.
So now Paul can hopefully, can you hear me really well now through the microphone?
I can hear you perfectly, yeah.
Okay, so if anybody wants to ask Paul a question, we need to give them this microphone, otherwise this computer won't receive it.
That's fair enough. Is there still the issue with the size of the PowerPoint slide?
Okay, now we don't see your PowerPoint slide at all. So all we see is
Okay,
you.
let's try, I'm gonna try to carry the entire
We'd rather see.
Oh,
Can't see
yeah.
this.
Right.
We can just flip the podium around.
We see-
No,
Just flip it.
We see Carrie in two.
now we see me.
And
Uh-oh, oh no, you wiggled it. Don't wiggle it.
which do you
Wiggle
prefer?
That thing is wiggle proof. Are you kidding me?
Okay, how's it looking now?
It's still small, but we
It's
might
beautiful.
just, it's okay.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Yeah, understood.
Let me
Well,
see.
hello
Wait,
everybody,
wait.
reading from Iowa
No,
City.
wait, hold on. Wait, stop. All right, I think that's as good as it's gonna get.
Okay, well, I mean, we can, I'll speak slowly and we can take Q&A and we'll go from there. But greetings all, I wish I could be there, but this is the next best thing. So if, Kara, should I just go ahead and start the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So when I first heard about Coptic SCRIPTORIUM, my initial excitement was understandably directed at the idea of a library of electronic Coptic texts. While it is no secret that there are near complete online libraries of Greek and Latin, the most extensive of these are currently paywall. So I welcomed all the more Coptic SCRIPTORIUM's commitment to open access. In the next decade, as we await the expansion of the Perseus Digital Library through Gregory Crane's Open Philology Initiative, we can be proud that, thanks to Carrie, Amir, and many other colleagues, Coptic will one day enjoy a similar library of freely accessible online content. In this talk, however, I want to explore a different component of the Coptic SCRIPTORIUM project, which fully shares in its revolutionary potential. That is its tokenization program, which separates Coptic texts into their component morphs, which can then be compared with other texts in the researcher's corpus, allowing for the exploration of connections in style and content. In particular, the automated tokenization of Coptic texts is a necessary first step for applying a rapidly developing set of practices in the digital humanities, which Franco Moretti has provocatively called distant reading, in contrast to the close reading that has always dominated scholarship in the humanities. Matthew Jockers, his former collaborator at the Stanford Literary Lab, who developed various computational methods for distant reading, prefers the term macro analysis on the analogy with economics. Jockers sees macro analysis as complementary to traditional forms of close reading and not a replacement for them. And his view is shared by many digital humanists, including myself, certainly. I like to use both terms to emphasize different levels of scale. For me, distant reading refers to the study of a literary text without actually reading its contents, at least on the level of sentence or poetic line. The most basic way to do this is the extraction and algorithmic manipulation of word frequencies. So distant reading might be performed on a single text or even a chapter of that text. Let's call this microanalysis. Or on a different scale, for a small to mid-sized literary corpus, as I will show for Coptic in a few minutes. And let's call this mesoanalysis, or simply corpus analysis. Macroanalysis, by contrast, is distant reading on a much larger corpus. For example, 1,000 or so British novels from the long 19th century. Indeed, much like early generative linguistics, most studies in distant reading have been performed on texts in English. For the past year and a half, I have been working towards applying distant reading to Greek and Latin literature, which is a very different set of interesting features and challenges than the Anglophone novel. First, I have been pursuing a meso-level study of the Greek Septuagint, New Testament, and Apocryphal literature, tentatively entitled Measuring the Canon at a Distance. And second, I am running an experimental graduate classics seminar this semester on distant reading classical and late antique Latin, in which we are working with enough text to consider our experiments macro-analysis. So again, nothing like big data necessarily, but certainly a lot of stuff to work with. In both the Greek and the Latin cases, the building block for distant reading is the creation of word frequency lists for each work, which can then be compared using algorithms with Python, but also in the statistics program R. This involves separating the texts into tokens, namely all individual instances of word forms, and then building word frequency tables based on the tokenized document. In Latin, as in English, this process is much easier because the tokens in digital texts are already mostly separated by spaces. So preparing them for study in R simply involves removing XML markup and punctuation, which is easily done in a text editor, and then creating a word vector in R in basic regular expressions. In Coptic, of course, tokenization involves breaking a text into its component morphemes, many of which are not separated by spaces, either in ancient manuscripts, certainly, or contemporary electronic texts, including the Nag Hammadi corpus from the Packard Humanities Institute and the New Testament. And while it is possible to tokenize individual texts by hand, when one wants to study an entire corpus of texts, this process becomes less feasible, if not impossible. Thus, we are all indebted to Coptic Scriptorium's tokenizer for making corpus analysis possible. And I mean that, it's absolutely extraordinary. It's just, a real way in which the field, I think, can move forward. A brief note about tokenization versus limitization. In my view, limitization is of major importance for the corpus analysis of Greek and Latin, even if there is no computationally good solution for it. That is, automated processes will always have some level of error. For example, it is helpful to resolve all grammatical cases of a key noun, such as theos, to have an idea of its true frequency in a document. By contrast, once a Coptic text has been tokenized, doing a full lemmatization will not alter the word frequency table as drastically. At least I think so. That's sort of a hypothesis. Probably the most significant area is the prenominal and pre-pronominal forms of verbs. Nor is Coptic lemmatization entirely straightforward. For example, one could arguably count statives as separate words, at least for the purpose of corpus analysis. With the tokenizer script from Coptic SCRIPTORIUM, the workflow is straightforward. I wanted to compare the Gospel of Thomas with the 4 canonical Gospels for my article, Measuring the Canon at a Distance. I had the PHI version of the Nag Hammadi library converted to Unicode with the help of my student Corey Taylor, and I used an electronic text of the Coptic New Testament generously provided by Christian Asplund. First, I manually separated these corpora into individual works and cleaned them in Text Wrangler. Then I applied the Perl script in Mac Terminal, exporting the tokenized words into a plain text file. Because I was not interested in part-of-speech tagging for this particular experiment, I removed all information inside the angled brackets, and after another round of removing line breaks, loaded the resulting files into R for textual analysis. Using Coptic in R proved more difficult. R is compatible with Unicode, but has developed a reputation among digital humanists for being somewhat capricious with non-Latin characters. I have not been able to use Coptic font on the command line in R or the RStudio environment, although the UTF-8 character codes were preserved with backslashes between letters. The backslashes prevented the effective use of some relevant R functions on Coptic word vectors, though it was possible to create basic data objects like frequency tables and then back convert them into Coptic fonts. I discussed the problem with Maciej Eder, a member of the Computational Stylistics group that publishes the library of custom R functions known as RStylo. He generously made the newest version of their library compatible with Coptic Unicode fonts. Though it is not yet released, I've tested it and all functions work. The output includes relevant information on words presented in Coptic Unicode. So this is another important thing, and thanks very much to Maciej for his help with this. Now to stylometrics, the quantitative study of authorial style. Historically, stylometry has been especially focused on authorial attribution for unknown or disputed works. As such, New Testament studies has always been at the margin of the field, above all, given the fixation on identifying Pauline authorship within the canon. But in my view, authorial attribution is probably the least interesting aspect of stylometry, as it is now practiced in contemporary digital humanities, which has turned to broader questions of variation across genre, gender, and time period. Furthermore, instead of trying to identify authorship, one can also cluster groups of related texts through various metrics that compare word usage across documents. This is what I have done using custom functions in RStylo with a small corpus consisting of the 4 canonical Gospels in Sahidic, as well as the Gospels of Thomas and Philip from the Nag Hammadi library. So there, I don't know if you can actually see the dendrogram if it's a small screenshot, but essentially you see the interesting results. So the following are the results as presented in a dendrogram using, there are various metrics you can mess around with. This one is just opening experiment, so I simply took the 100 most frequent words, didn't take any out if they didn't appear across documents, and I used a delta distance, Burroughs delta, which is a standard stylometric metric. And so in the dendrogram, it essentially shows the relationship between texts in the form of various branches. So in this particular branch, you can see that the synoptics are together, and then form a higher branch with John, and then all four of the canonical Gospels are then on the main stem opposed to Thomas and Philip. I wanted to experiment a bit more to test the hypothesis that the Gospel of Thomas was closely related to the sayings Gospel genre, and in particular Q. Using the Lucan passages from the so-called critical edition of Q, I ran the same clustering algorithms and found that Q, in fact, is clustered together with Thomas and Philip and against the four canonical Gospels. This is certainly an interesting initial result, and again, these are just very preliminary experiments that bears further exploration and reflection. In general, digital humanities work such as this can both provide evidence for or against older hypotheses and open up new avenues of exploration by suggesting unexpected connections. Here, while scholars have often assumed a close affiliation between Q and Thomas, the dendrogram shows a similar link with Philip. I am confident in such discoveries that more such discoveries await further exploration of the Sahidic New Testament and the Nag Hammadi library. In conclusion, I want to return to some ongoing aspects of my research, which I hope to publish in an introductory article. One of the principles of authorship attribution is that the most significant distinguishing factor for determining an author is the use of so-called stop or function words. Yet I am not satisfied with the stylometric focus on stop word, whether for authorship attribution or the clustering of Coptic gospel literature that I have just introduced. For various reasons, I think that the sharing of content words is of greater importance because I suspect that it represents the kind of macro level intertextuality. One way to do this is topic modeling, which I am currently working on for Greek biblical and apocryphal literature, and plan to initiate soon for the Coptic Nag Hammadi library. But a simpler and perhaps more effective way to cluster documents by shared content would be to remove all of the stop words. This would be a more fine-grained approach at the lexical level than topic modeling, but still a form of distant intertextuality. There is no agreed-upon definition of function words, or morphs, though they are often carriers of grammatical information and distinguished from content words, especially nouns, adjectives, and verbs. The majority of the highest frequency words in any document are function words, including in English, articles such as the and pronouns such as he or she. I am currently working on a working list of function words for Coptic to be published as a CSV file for easy use in corpus analysis. My provisional list includes determiners, specifiers, all pronouns, nexus marks, non-derivative punctuation markers, prepositions, various particles, and some adverbs, among other bits and pieces. As I move forward on my corpus analysis of Coptic literature, I want to include other documents from the Nag Hammadi library. But this raises the interesting issue of comparing texts across different dialects. As far as I know, this sort of question has not been addressed by digital humanities researchers. Again, it's not that necessary, at least for doing the 19th century novel, though I suspect it has been addressed in corpus linguistics. Because Coptic dialectical differences are largely phonetic, this question is related, however, to orthographic normalization. A necessity, for example, in doing a macro analysis of classical and patristic Latin. Provisionally, I plan to normalize subacademic texts such as the Apocryphon of James by simply providing the Sahidic equivalent. In the rare cases when a subacademic word has no Sahidic equivalent, I will leave it. This feels like a reasonable solution for dealing with the Nag Hammadi library, though I'm sure it will be controversial, and I would be hesitant to normalize texts in other dialects in this way. Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself a little bit. Finally, corpus analysis of the Sahidic New Testament will give major interest in the study of Greek loanwords in Coptic, in which descriptive statistics are focused on percentage of the total lexicon. Okay, so it's been estimated that they make up 20% of the total New Testament lexicon, but not taking into account relative frequency. A quick glance shows that the most common Greek loan word is Allah, which is the 72nd most common overall. Mathetes is next at 73rd, and Pistella at 98. So only 3% of the 100 most frequently occurring Coptic words are Greek, not surprising given that most loan words are content rather than function words. It will also be interesting to compare Greek word frequency in individual Coptic parts with the same word frequency in the corresponding Greek New Testament. In concluding then, I want to return to the great promise of Coptic Scriptorium, a large digital library in which we don't get lost in books, but between them, searching for links in ways that extend our traditional notions of intertextuality. As Foucault noted in a prophetic apophthegm that has curiously slipped the attention of digital humanists, the frontiers of a book are never clear-cut. Beyond the first lines and the last full stop, beyond its internal configuration and its autonomous form, it is caught up in the system of references to other books, other texts, other sentences. It is a node within a network. Indeed, one can use the clustering algorithms to create networks of books. In short, this is Coptic Scriptorium beyond the manuscript, a sea of tokens shared by texts and clustering them together. Thank you.
Does Beth want to do the?
Hi, Paul. This is Beth Platty. Can you hear me? You good?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I'll field some questions for you if the audience has any, and we're gonna have to go back and forth with the microphone. So.
Sure.
Tell them my jaw has dropped.
Gary's jaw has dropped.
Can you tell me?
But I think I heard awesome and amazing as other words as well. So, yeah.
Very kind.
I have a specific question on Gospel of Thomas if you want to start with something else.
Oh, come on. Gospel of Thomas is, everybody loves Gospel of
Hi,
Thomas.
Paul. This is Philip Seller.
Hey, Phil.
Thank you for a very interesting paper. I was really very intrigued by most of it anyway, and some of it I just didn't understand probably.
Thank you.
In terms of your way of doing a family tree or stem analysis of Gospels by stylometric means,
Yes.
and I found that very interesting, and it raises another question for me. As you said, in effect, that is a byproduct of genre, right? Saying's gospel is going to have a certain kind of discourse as opposed to a more philosophical dialogue-based text like the Gospel of John. And I wondered whether we need to pay attention to that kind of question as we sort these texts, because I think the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas share a lot of ideology, even though they don't share as much syntactic kind of presentation, discourse level presentation. So I find that an interesting contrast, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that has to, that's connected to the idea of clustering according to theme rather than style. So actually the ideograms that I showed for this presentation were based on the 100 most frequent words. So we're dealing mostly with function words. So what I'd like to do, I think what gets us closer to comparing ideology is to cluster based on content work.
Right.
So not cutting out the first 100. And that is more, gets more to sharing at a lexical level. And if we want to look at broader discourses, then we need to do topic modeling.
Yeah, so like John will have many fewer instances of the word legate or apon or something like that, verbs
Right.
of speech, whereas Mark and Thomas will say over and over again, he said, he was saying, he said. And John allows Jesus to speak for a whole paragraph, uninterrupted.
Yes, okay, and now I see what you're saying too regarding genre, definitely.
Yeah.
So, further testing for trying to determine the emphasis of genre on style. And there is good evidence in the English novel corpus that genre, if you choose a particular genre, then you are more constrained in your stylistic usage. That can also be tested with the ancient corpus. However, it's good to have a fairly large sample set for each genre. So for something like the same genre, to run a good classification algorithm on that, which would be part of the process, we would need more. So we, this is an ongoing issue in dealing with ancient documents in general, and is a complicating factor with saint gospels.
Right. Well, my other question is on a completely different topic, so maybe I'll see if there's time.
Sure.
Hi, Paul. It's Joel.
Hello.
Hey, I have a technical question, and I apologize in advance if it's not comprehensible to some. I'm curious about the preparation of the text with Unicode and handling the Unicode. I assume as you were preparing that, you were using regular expressions to do your preparation of the work ahead of time.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Did you encounter any problems in the use of regular expressions in areas of Unicode that are beyond the norm? Unicode understands, that the people who run Unicode understand it's complicated, and they've distinguished 3 areas of regular expression support. And interestingly, some of Coptic falls in that, especially with the combining characters. There's no guarantee that a period will find a combining character on its own or in conjunction with the underlying base character. And I think there may be other issues like that. And one thing I'm hoping to learn from you who are working on digital projects with Coptic is what kinds of problems with Unicode have you found in actually the nuts and bolts of your projects?
Thanks for that question. Essentially, and I think I was lucky here, as far as removing punctuation, periods, whatever periods had crept into the PHI Nag Hammadi or Christian New Testament corpus, there wasn't an issue in removing those. I didn't see any complication there. And other than that, I didn't actually work so much inside of the Coptic text as around it. For instance, removing tags. So it didn't raise any issues there. I mean, for me, the ongoing headache is how to use Coptic and to a lesser extent Greek in a program like Paul. And by the good graces of Maciej Eder, it's possible to do basic work, but in terms of creating custom functions, it's still a complicating factor that you can't use Coptic font on the command line.
Hey, Paul, it's Carrie. I just want to jump in on here to say we had a problem with one of our Perl scripts in that we had originally, I think it's our normalizer that strips a lot of these like superlinear strokes and things like that from especially like the diplomatic transcription of the manuscripts. And for some reason it worked for a while with, just kind of remove and then a whole string of, and if you see any of these things, remove them all. And then at one point, that part of the script stopped working. I don't know why, but it just didn't. At one point I noticed it wasn't really working properly. So then I went in and I changed it to do everything individually. We couldn't just string together all the little diacritics because they were overlapping. There was just something about them that was screwing up Perl. So we just went through and changed it to be an individual command for every character.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a minor thing, but it was, so it does happen. And then we sometimes have problems importing into Mac. We had some problems importing into Mac Excel, Microsoft Excel. getting the cutting and pasting is not a problem, but like importing a different format, a different document type into, it is very difficult. So yeah.
You should graph.
Yeah, graph that. Yeah.
Code
So, and we're going over, but I think we have a lot of extra time at the end, and I think because Paul's here, it's okay to go over. So.
If there's somebody else.
I think it's on.
This is, I hope, will be of interest to other people in the room. They can help out, start with some strength especially. The question of your comparison of Coptic text, Sahidic Coptic New Testament, or something with Greek was very interesting to me. And it raised the question to me of this, I think the innocent first-time reader like myself, when I first looked at this, I thought of this as a translation issue. And you remember the first generation of editions of Nakamadi, even Bentley Leighton's dissertation, where you don't translate the Greek, you transliterate it. You maintain the Greek alphabet for words of Greek origin, which suggests that the translator hasn't actually translated at all. It's simply kind of imported the word. I wonder if these comparisons allow us to distinguish between the translator's question, which is, do I have an Egyptian equivalent of this word? Do I want this word? From the other question is, has this word been integrated into Egyptian? So that Bentley Leighton's to me, it was very important distinction of Coptic words of Greek origin, but they're not Greek words anymore. Okay, so we occasionally have those cases where you can compare the Coptic and the Greek, and there's a very nice chance to use an Egyptian word for a Greek word the other way around, and the Sahidic version doesn't necessarily make those same choices, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So are these tools able to distinguish a translation use of Greek as opposed to more like indigenized, naturalized?
Well,
is this a discourse question?
No, I definitely, thank you. I definitely see what you're trying to say there. It's an important point and a big question, and one that I'm not prepared to answer at this point, not having actually looked at these issues. But I mean, I think a quantitative comparison between Coptic Matthew and Greek Matthew would allow us to zero in on certain words, like perhaps not big days as almost 1-to-1 ratio between Greek and Coptic, whereas prophetes doesn't yet. So I don't know if there's a question that I think we can really only do by doing kind of work. And I'm fascinated to see what comes of it.
Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Paul, for joining us.
Oh, thanks, everybody. And I may just stick around here. I'll put myself on mute.
Okay. And well, I'm going to unplug you from here, and so do you have a computer?
We should distribute them.
I've got it.
Is there that?
Yeah, VGA.
There's some zeros, right?
Yes.
Sorry.
Power, you need power, it's over there. It's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think did I meet you when I was here in September, like in the hallway or something?
Yes, you did.
Okay, you're good.
And then if you feel comfortable.
Okay.
I've had Microsoft Excel for Mac is dumbed down PC version. It's like web issues. I don't recommend it.
if you're going to use Excel, you do the configuration yourself. It's true also for Word as well.
Yeah, Apple has its own version, that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I usually use Morel for word processing.
Pyramids.
Excel is
Do you want?
Sure.
No, it's good. Open source.
Do you need help? But you got it. But why do that encode all the superlinear strokes instead of using the keystroke character? We use the keystroke character because we see them as characters.
So our last speaker for this panel, and then we'll have a coffee break after discussion, is So Miyagawa from all the way from Kyoto University. So probably the person who traveled the farthest today to get here. And he'll be talking about synthesis, boundness, and clitics and synthetic optic.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Super Mont, Elizabeth. Nofri Namerati, Nofri Mate. I would like to do presentation in Bahari Coptic with great Coptic pronunciation, but unfortunately, I have to do it in my very poor English with Japanese accent. So please be patient. And today I would like to talk about synthesis of boundness and clitics in scientific Coptic. And my name is Miyagawa. I'm based on Miyagawa, and so is, of course, it is to drink in Coptic. Creation in Japanese. Yeah. But, here. Oh. Okay. So today this is today's outline, and first of all, I would like to talk about synthesis. And synthesis is a linguistic index of how many morphemes a word can have in the language, and their hierarchy is the highest synthesis called polysynthetic, or synthesis, and the lowest synthesis is analysis. And if the language is polysynthetic, one word can have many morphs and function as a sentence. And if the language is highly analytic, a word is usually one morph, like Vietnamese or Chinese. And this is an example of a synthetic language. This is classical Nahuatl. It is used as second language, or model with its signal. And this is verb, and this has it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This verb has 8 morphs. This is polysynthetic, and this is example of a synthetic language. It is all Nubian, and each word has 2 or 3 morphs in this language usually. And this is a very highly analytic language, all Chinese, and each word has only 1 morph in this language. The analyticity is higher than modern Chinese in this language. And how about the Coptic? What scholars say about the index of synthesis of Coptic language differs enormously. Coptic is, according to Loprieno, it is polysynthetic. But according to Haspermas, it is synthetic. But writing is AKD and the European scholar like Junge, Coptic is analytic. So why? When you take a look at this sentence. This is from concordance du the New Testament, Coptic, I don't know, but it is from concordance of New Testament in Coptic by Wilmer. This is a very long word, long word, and JKM repet hitu ok and negmeste pek jaje, and this word look like thing has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11 moves, and this word look like thing is seems to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay, 7 moves, and sorry, and but these what look like things are not words, because spaces in printed Coptic text invented in the 17th to 18th centuries. According to Hanitaka, the first step to divide the words was probably done by the scholars in Europe as early as 70s. Maybe I think we should put as 70th and 18th centuries. Foremost among them is the Coptic Raphael al-Turki, residing in the Vatican. Eventually, the same system was employed by Copts when they published their first printed text during the days of Pope Cyril IV or shortly after. So spaces are invented in the 17th to 19th century. And then what are the spaces in Coptic text? I divided them into 4 types and created the chart. This is the 4 types. First, if the text has spaces before copulars and has spaces after pronominal prepositions except for an or a, and it has spaces after pronominal verbs, it is type 1. And if it has not, it doesn't have spaces after pronominal verbs, it is type 2. And it does not have spaces after pronominal prepositions except for an or a, it is type 3. And it doesn't have any spaces before copulars and after pronominal prepositions and after pronominal verbs, it is type 4. And here are the examples. Type 1 is Becket's Johannes Evangelium and Lucas Evangelium and their Barcelona Codex collection, the text. And type 2 is Lamden's their other scholar of Semitic languages and the Lamden's grammar book. And type 3 is Latin grammar and Coptic SCRIPTORIUM accepting beta letters, and White Young's Shanutian text and Polish text. And type 4 is Wilmer's concordance of New Testament in Cyrillic Coptic and the Coptic SCRIPTORIUM with the beta letters. And here are the examples. Type 1, Avo Aer and Mentreje Paipe. So there is many spaces, especially I spaces and Mentre and J spaces, I a space, okay, like that. But in type 4, I Mentre J Paipe. So there's no spaces like type 1 in this. Mentre, this is a compound verb, and this one, the J and Pipe, the coupler, there are no spaces in this chunk. And Layton's bound group. Bound group is described in Layton's authoritative grammar, and it belongs to type 3. And I think Coptic SCRIPTORIUM adapt this bound group, the concept of bound group. And bound group is based on Layton's prosodical interpretation. And bound group has only one stress in itself. And that's why, as famous linguist type 4, this has been Matt called it a stress group. And but there are problems. because we did not have crucial evidence regarding whether one morph had stress or not in the period in which side Coptic was spoken. However, Reitan's interpretation of Coptic stress positions can be supported by Prince's study of 20th century Coptic pronunciation in the Mass. You can download it on the web. And hints to separate words. There are also hints to separate words in Coptic. Reitan's bound group can be right for the prosodical grouping with one stress. However, it does mean a word itself. Then couldn't we find the clues in Coptic text? Punctuations and diacritics could be the clues. And the most frequent used punctuation is upper dots. Here's upper dots, P.J. Parangelos, M. Pujoy, Snaf, upper dot, J. M. R. Hote, Zacharias, upper dot, J. Au Sotem, Epexops, upper dot. This upper dot seems to divide clauses, or it marks the end of a sentence, but not words. And there are examples of more micro-level upper dots. In some manuscripts, upper dots are used for separating more micro-level units. This one, this is Macquarie University, P. Macquarie. This is a magical papyri. It is called magical papyri. And this is Angelos Apadot Etuvab Apadot Henkom Apadot Biot. So these seem to be similar to Reitan's bound group. And this apostrophe-like signs. This sign was placed in more micro-level boundary. It can be seen especially in Chinese manuscripts like Anaugar et Tagape. We see the love design and half many design and header in Upura inside this sign to the God. And other sign, there are also other signs, but nothing looks indicating a word boundary. Dots, commas, currents, more dislike sign. These are more macro level boundary. They are boundaries of more macro level units than words. So here's the diacritics. The representative of diacritics and the superlinear strokes. Superlinear strokes, so-called syllable markers. If you see anthem, this chunk, you may get confused. But if there are superlinear strokes like enten to ment iot, you can distinguish syllables like enten to ment iot. Superlinear strokes told us how we should separate syllables, as it can be useful to distinguish words, but it is too micro-level than words. So brief summary, summarizing above, punctuation marks mainly divide clauses and sentences, and superlinear strokes are hints to divide syllables. They can be clues for us to divide words in Coptic text. However, they are incomplete for their purpose, and no marks seem to have been designed for marking word boundaries consistently. And here is another tool. The Bokanaga critics, as many classicists were aware, Bokanaga critics or hit critics such as de Garo K always occur in the second element in the sentence. Therefore, they reveal the boundary between the first and second elements in the Coptic sentence. However, this syntactic element does not always indicate a word. It can also indicate a phrase. So I'd like to introduce critics, the so-called critics of Coptic linguistics. Reitan's bound group is well established. However, it just indicates a prosodic group with one stress. So there is a possibility that there is a bound group with some words. But cross-linguistically, there are words which have no stress. And modern linguists call them critics from Zubetsky's several studies, and typical critics in English, the or of should or I've or the of his, it is abbreviation of their copyright, and the book is both good. And when the has no stress, but syntactically it's a word, they function in the same way as the full forms it is, have, and is. This is their introduction example of critics. It is Japanese, my mother tongue. In modern Japanese, as in Coptic, there are no spaces in the writing system, And scholars in the past disputed whether the positions, particles, and converbs are words or affixes. However, recent linguistic studies tend to regard them as critics and not as affixes, following the current linguistic trend after Zubetsky's several studies. They have no stress, so they are prosodically dependent, like J or et or hem or e in Coptic. Here's the example. This one, 僕はね、今から有名なジョージタウン大学で発表していて、とても緊張してるんですが、For me, I'm enjoying a presentation that by Mr. Johnson, and you know, I'm very nervous. I'm native speaker, so this is very right Japanese. So here, case particle, but this one is these two critics, and this one is critic, and this one is critic, and these two are critics, and this one critics. This is the modern linguistic Japanese, and this is according to modern linguistics, modern Japanese linguistics. And a critic is a grammatical word. We call it just a word, but it is not a phonological prosodic word. In other words, it is prosodically independent, but grammatically independent. Therefore, although it behaves like an affix phonologically, it is in fact a word. Thus, modern linguistics morphs according to the two dimensions, morphosyntax and phonology, or prosody. The boundary of two critics, or one critic and one host word, is marked by an equal sign, this one, according to the well-organized Leipzig grossing rules by the Max Planck Institute for the Evolutionary Anthropology. So, yeah, and Haspermat and Sims proposes 6 good criteria for distinguishing affixes and critics. One, freedom of post-action, and affixes have no freedom of stem selection. Critics has possible freedom of movement, but affixes don't have any freedom of movement, and critics has critics are less prosodically integrated, but affixes are more prosodically integrated. Critics maybe outside the domain of a phonological rule, and affixes are within the domain of a phonological rules, and so on. And among these criteria, the most clear-cut criterion that determines which morph is more syntactically independent is freedom of post-action, like in critics in English. The Coptic parchment is beautiful. The Coptic parchment I saw is beautiful. The Coptic parchment I saw is beautiful. This attached to this noun and this verb and this adverb. So this the has freedom of post-action, and therefore it is a critic. So applying this to for Coptic, we can see J is a critic. Conjunction or complementizer J is a critic because it has FHS. It can attach to negative particle and interrogative pronoun, and verb, and demonstrative pronoun, I, and auxiliary articles, kunoki, pu, and now, J, Jakob, Jacob, personal pronoun, J Antov, and conjunction J Hotam. And so it has absolutely it has a freedom of host selection. Moreover, J can take this sign after it. J and how so on. So it is absolutely prophylactic. And I think it is possibly a critic verb. It can take verb and preposition and adverb. And articles also are probably critics. It can take it, the computer, nouns, snail, brothers, different article, pupet to whole. It is double different article, but it's very curious. But I think this is the yeah, because it is I think the reason is this different article is critic. So and causative verb retract 10 comma and compound verb hemme and adverb hang aboard. This one is also very peculiar, but I think it is very good example that showing their articles are critics. And pronoun prepositions, verbs, and auxiliaries are also critics. Phenomenal prepositions are status constructors of prepositions or verbs and auxiliaries. I think they are also critics. We have two choices, namely to consider say hem ra and three words hem and pu and ra, or to consider it as two words hem pu ra. This is two solutions, but if we took this head marking solution, it is not rational because it can be hang around and pull around, but if this hem is prefix to round, I don't know, hem round doesn't isn't established. So that's pronominal and these pronominal status pronominalis has can to this word pu and also hem round is okay. So this pronominal preposition has freedom of host selection, somewhat freedom of host selection. So pronominal verbs and pronominal auxiliaries are also critics in this way. And the exceptions maybe, however, some pronominal prepositions before be announced are difficult to consider as critics because they are too frequently used in this board. I think in Coptic SCRIPTORIUM it is considered as adverb, right? But I think it can be analyzed as a plus both. A is preposition to and board is outside, and to and this is highly exercised. And like pronominal preposition, pronominal verbs before be announced are difficult to be critics, like el hote to pronominal status pronominalis and fear. The summary is J and S are critics and articles are critics, and pronominal prepositions, verbs, and auxiliaries before articles are critics. And morpheme per word is one of indices to consider synthetic level of a language. With Greenlandics and morphemes per word is 3.72, and Sanskrit 2.59, and Swahili 2.55, Old English 2.12, Latvian 1.93, German 1.92, and Modern English 1.68, Vietnamese 1.06. And after applying the summary, this one, I examined morphemes per word of the letter of Aftonia by Desa in Coptic SCRIPTORIUM. Here are the results. The running number of words is 822, and running number of morphs is 1,167, and running number of morphemes per word is 1.4 to 1437272. The results show that Coptic morphemes per word lies between modern English, it is analytic language, and Vietnamese highly analytic language. Right? And Coptic lies between this. And therefore, Coptic is probably an analytic language. His conclusion: the synthesis of Coptic differs from scholar to scholar. The cause is the word. The reason is the word boundary in Coptic is difficult to determine, and the spaces, the modern convention, and punctuation and diacritics are not completely useful for discerning word boundaries. And I introduce the modern linguistic concept of critics in this study that makes it possible to describe Coptic morphosyntax better. And the major way to distinguish critics with affixes is freedom of host selection. And from the standpoint of freedom of host selection, we identified articles, phenomenal verbs, auxiliaries, and prepositions as critics. And its morphemes per word is lies between Vietnamese, it is highly analytic language, and modern English, it is analytic. And judging by this, we can say Coptic is an analytic language. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions, I think, and then we'll have a discussion as well.
Okay.
So I have 3 points. First is we need to closer investigate the usage of such diacritics in Coptic language.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the first point. There are
Yes.
different levels, and it depends on the manuscript. And you can't tell much about these things without knowing what is really in the manuscript. And there's also difference between dialects.
Right.
Of course, it depends on the handwriting and the system is used. I mean, for your purposes, there are several things in play. You have the phenomena of grammaticalization and other things. And for example, the j, there are cases when j is a morph or a word that has different semantic functions. And this depends also on etymology and other things. So in some cases, you can elide it with the following unit or not, and sometimes not. So there's also semantics in play. And the best thing to study such phenomena like critics is the construct forms that Coptic has. And this is still, let's say, against the tendency of the analytics in Coptic that you have attributes always with in followed the other unit, that the ancient Egyptian composition. But these are still different lexical units. So you have the man, or man in general, Homer, and the construct forms forming also prefixes. The rim and the rimmen and other things. And I have to confess that I sometimes doubt if this really helps us to better understand the Coptic language as an Egyptian language. So sorry, I can't see here much help. First, we have to analyze what is in the manuscript. I mean, Martin Haspelmark had made a couple of valuable contributions to this, but I think, as far as I know, he doesn't know much Egyptian.
Yeah.
And so then you have to work with philologists and to distinguish what really you need and what linguistics can help us to analyze a language. and these phenomena, and then also these other languages from the Eskimo languages. It's good for statistics, but for me, yeah, it's nice to know, but then that's it.
I have a couple comments and lots of questions for you, really. I can't get all of them into this slot, so we'll have to talk later. I want to first say something about BESA. Probably BESA and Scriptorium should be unified with the rest. I have an idea why historically it might have been done differently with respect to the copula. I think it's to do with BESA's rather idiosyncratic use of the copula in initial position. So BESA has a very unusual habit of starting sentences with K, to mean so, or something like that. No other author does it as far as it means with K. Something that Ethan Grossman once devoted to. So this may be why, but it should be. That is basically a mistake. I was really fascinated to see your typology of the different types of spacing. I wanted to add one criterion to that. I'm not sure it completely aligns with all the others, which is the behavior of a key. A lot of people write that separate. Leighton writes it bound. And that was also something that we changed relatively late. And I guess if I had one question to ask you, it would be your typology here kind of skips from synthetic to analytic. Do you think that the term evolutionative has any value, and how would that apply?
Yes, but the algorithmic is at the dimension is in that dimension. It belongs to the fusion, the indexes of fusion, maybe. And if indexes of fusion is high, it is a infractional or fusion language like Sanskrit. And if the index of fusion is low, it is agglutinative language like Japanese Jojen.
Right. So you have things in Coptic that are similar, like Aftef Sultan, right? So in Sanskrit, that would be a pattern of one of the conjugations. And, in Coptic, it's a bit like Japanese a little bit.
Yeah, agglutinative. Yes. It's like agglutinative. But I think it is in the way of grammaticalization from the critic to affixes. I say about a lot of Coptic morphs. So maybe it is. Yeah, I think it is. The Coptic is in the way of moving from analytic to specific language, but I think it's very difficult to determine.
I agree, and I like the term critic better than affix for these things.
Yeah,
the characteristic is that these are based on syntactic function. You say that there's freedom of host selection.
Yes.
Morphologically, absolutely true. But the thing that you find after ete is simply a derivative clause. The reason why you find these different adverb, prepositional phrase, that's because that's the predicate of a derivative clause with a null subject. Or the same for the articles. What you find after them is a nominal phrase. What you find after the prepositions is always, so the fact that you sometimes find an article or not, that's to do because I think Ariel Shishalevi called Coptic an actualizing. I think this goes back to Polotsky also. So whatever you put in that slot, it becomes a noun. Like if you put it after that, it's how Coptic works.
Yeah, I have a question or observation that goes on that. When you're trying to analyze which are critic and not, I found that the question of ja and et the most complicated, and whether or not ja has elision or traces might be phonological. I'm not sure, but they both, to my reading, seem to be connected to phrases.
Right.
Then it doesn't. So it's really kind of random whether. So you have this long list. Well, ja can go before a noun or a verb or a verb. Sure, because it's going to it's actually not connected to whatever's first in the phrase. It's connected to the phrase, and at the. So whether that removes it from the FHS thing, does it has to go before the phrase? Right?
Yeah, that's exactly.
So it's always before
the phrase. Yesterday's.
Yeah, no, it's actually proves it different.
Yeah, I don't mind. I don't mind, but you shouldn't. I don't think you should list us all separate examples of freedom.
So the very common in Sahelic is the translation of the Greek party Kazal, that is Jan. We have Jan, we have also the Jan, but just meaning that here starts the tension.
Yeah. Which is
So
also
that is
true for
what I mean,
Hachi.
there's difference among levels. And then I don't know that this is worth investigating.
But I think on another level, Java is still doing something that's introducing.
Yeah,
You can translate because or
Yeah.
quote.
yeah, that's rather.
I have a linguistics question about this freedom of post-selection criterion. I think it definitely works to identify clitics. So if you have a positive result, if you have an element that has freedom of post-selection, it's for sure a clitic. But if you have an element that doesn't have freedom of post-selection, it could still be a clitic. There are certain clitics that don't have freedom of post-selection, like French clitics, like French object clitics only attached to verbs, but they're still clitics. So I just want to suggest that maybe there are even more clitics than you've identified in Coptic if you use other criteria and try to think about identifying.
No, yeah, there are similar critics like French to Japan has also that kind of critics.
Yeah.
And no, it's thank you.
So I think we should probably move on to discussion now for about 15 minutes of the 3 papers that we heard. Although is Paul still with us? Paul's gone offline, but it means that Deso can at least sit down if he wants. So he doesn't have to be like on the spot.
I want to add to what Ruth said, that the opposite also holds. So Coptic critics, for instance, don't obey the phonological criterion. So Coptic prepositions regularly assimilate the first consonant of whatever follows them, regardless of syntactic category. Boom versus boom is oblivious to see.
In Greek, it's a matter of stress or accent of some sort.
Yeah,
Often used as a criteria. So
Right, but assimilation only happens within words. So it's sim and sim, that's only because that's considered to be a
I was wondering whether that's a factor too, whether it's part of your boundary question. Inability to have independent stress. Because, yeah, indeed. It's never what I just said. Ooh, I wasn't
But all of these things don't match up, is what I'm trying to say. But it's so soon in Great Greek of the preposition will not, I believe at least, will not assimilate with the following in, right? Whereas as a verbal particle,
not in orthographically corrected condition. Manuscripts.
Okay, fair enough.
You get to move. You get to move.
Can I ask you, Amir, and Carrie, and other projects, what's your policy on spaces, word spaces?
Actual spaces in the manuscript?
Your digital product, what are you doing? What's your policy on white space in any Unicode file?
So I can take that. Yeah, I mean, we had a huge discussion about this, and this is apparently a big issue in digital editions of manuscripts. How do you encode white space, or how, what do you do with white space? And because at first I was just like, typing it using the space bar, and this was a problem because corpus linguist tools, read spaces as nothing, and so so now we are trying to standardize the practice of using the TI element high and rend to encode how many spaces to the right or to the left of a character. We usually do it usually happens around a raised dot, and before or after a raised dot, there's a white space. There's not the raised dot that goes above the letter, but that like high, the period, end of sentence period, raised period. And so we encode that. It's the same element that we use for like red or tall or large letters. Instead of red and tall, it's so it's like one space right or 2 spaces left. And then in the visualization, so this will come up in 2 different places then. So when you search using ANIS, you can search the high. It's sort of like a highlight, the high field for space. You could search it for space, and it will show you wherever we've encoded white space in the manuscript, and it will show you how many spaces. And then in the visualization, the visualization of the manuscript transcription, so we have all those different visualizations that Amir had up, one of which looks like the manuscript. So in that one that looks like the 2 columns of the manuscript, we will have then 2 spaces after the raised period or a space before, depending on how it's been encoded, so that it's both, it's searchable and then gets visualized. Now, I will say this is one thing in which there's, I mean, we haven't tested it, but I'm guessing there are inconsistencies and inter-annotator disagreements on this. So, you know, the annotators are not, I know, I don't hear any annotators laughing in the background.
They're trying to guess how many spaces.
Right.
How many calculators we've gotten in that space.
Right, and so I mean, we've been using like the letter, I think the standard paleography is to use the nu as, you know, how many nus can you fit in there? So as how many characters or spaces. So that is what we, but it's, you know, it's very subjective. But especially spaces that come, there sometimes looks like there's a space before the raised dot, and that's very subjective. Is it just, you know, was the scribe just being lazy, or did he, you know, or not precise, or set, yeah, or what is, you know, so.
We're coding it A as an annotation rather than a token, and B, the subtype of annotation is the same that we use for declarations. So we view it as a type of declaration.
Yeah, so it's not a token. The white space is not a token like the words are, but it is an encoding that you could find if you wanted to find it.
But what you're saying suggests that you've adopted a diplomatic edition policy only, and you're not interested in producing normalized editions, or do I have that?
No, we have normalized, but
So
that is not. We don't put.
What's your white space policy on normalized? I mean, we've seen in So's paper earlier that there are 4 different approaches to normalizing white space, and I'm really curious as to.
So no, what Phil was talking about is introducing white space by normalization, not how to encode white space in the
And I'm interested in both questions. I know they're separate, but they are important. Each type of question, each one is important too.
So we're supposedly using type 4, except we messed up in basic. But our guideline is to use what is called type 4. We try to follow late, because that's what we're doing. But there's also kill. So a lot of the German projects are using.
But either way, in ours, I mean, there's a layer of data where you can, we'll go through this more detail tomorrow morning, but there's a layer of data which are just the pieces, the morphemes, but then not those sub things like the meant to the rest. So there's the basic morphemes that are tagged for part of speech, like the nouns and the verbs or the converters. If it's a compound, then that's annotated further with those little pieces like meant ref. And then there's a layer that's for the bound groups, which basically takes the data in the morpheme layer and smushes it together according to our standards. So depending on how you get to that, you're either smushing it together or taking it apart at different stages of the process. Like the tokenizer will take those bound groups apart. So yeah, and then there's, on our visualizations of the normalized text, spaces appear between those bound groups according to, roughly according to Leighton. Leighton is our guide. But the data you can all search separately, so that yeah, so you can still search the data otherwise. And we've tried to encode wherever possible for the manuscript ones those little marks between words, like those things that look like apostrophes but aren't. However, that is really hard because you get to the point where you're like, is that a smudge? Is that an apostrophe? Is that like something leaking in from the other side? And those are very hard, I think, to transcribe accurately, although worth trying to do, but I think they're very hard. So.
We have this issue in our adopting Coptic people. We want to have a way of doing strokes, gingins, and I think it's not surprising that the community is because I think that Bentley Layton maybe has a lot of influence on how those texts are being published.
This is our interpretation of Layton, which is it's a min-listes short. So this is a bound group. Incidentally, by some complete accident, you can see that this was one where the diplomatic actually had the apostrophe after the thing. And from here it's short, and we interpret that to be a new bound group. So hang on, the names of the annotation here slipped away. Yeah. So this is the morph layer where mint and listes are separate. Mint listes is a noun, and that is the norm unit. The norm group, the bound group, contains mint listes. And the diplomatic version of this has all of the superlinear strokes, including between the letters and covering 3 letters, and the apostrophe. And parts of speech are assigned at the unit level, either norm or orig. So the orig one is with the spelling variants and diacritics, and the norm is without. And any and all of these are searchable, so you can decide. And they are also the basis for the different visualizations. So the analytic and normalized text take the norm units, the norm groups as their unit, and place spaces between those. It's just a visualization thing though. So these are eteknelpidze is written together because this takes the norm groups and places spaces between them. And the diplomatic view takes
Well, hopefully it's all visualized properly.
oh yeah, that would be good. Yeah, so it's like supposed to be like the manuscript. It includes the apostrophes and the dots and decorations, and also line breaks within the middle of the word because this is just doing the line breaks according to the manuscript. So that's a diplomatic view, and they're both generated from the same data model that behaves like this grid. And this is the normal.
Are there linguists who can comment on these texts? Because I noticed that Nagamati Volume
Not a linguist, but a manuscript person back there.
Nagamati Volume 2 is published by Bentley Layton, includes all of them. This is interesting note in the instructions. I have no idea what these mean, but someone will someday. So I'm going to look it up.
That's pretty much how we taught it there.
Yeah.
So, but since 1983, we published that as someone.
Sure, someone has.
I don't think so.
In the Chinooda project, we encode all of that. We encode like all white space. That seems to be intentional white space. So all of that is unique. So each one of us has our own coding system, but it will all be unified in the end. It will be made.
And yeah, right now we're working on some of David Brackey's manuscript transcriptions for the Chinooda project, and are going to be having a couple of his manuscript witnesses, hopefully online at the end of the spring, and to add more Chinooda material to it as well. And yeah, we can see how he's done that. But yeah. And it's interesting because those little apostrophes come in the middle of things that we sometimes think of as words, and or think of as bound. At least we think of them as bound, like mamin mamoff. You remember we had this whole conversation, and I was like, mamin mamoff, that should be segmented, and somebody else said no.
His criterion is that nothing can ever come between them, and they are completely must come together. Nothing
Right.
can come between you.
But you'll see the apostrophe between the mamin and the mamoff in manuscripts sometimes. Yeah.
Are they readers? Pronunciation.
Maybe.
I mean, so a month is a thing by itself, right? So maybe that. I mean, but I'm not even sure. What's the etymology of mean? What's the etymology of mean and month?
This always makes me feel better when I'm puzzling over something, and then somebody says, "Oh yeah, we don't know."
Maybe someone figure it out. I think the most basic sign of boundedness in Coptic is the use of the plain vowels. So this, all these what we call superlinear strokes, this is the sign of boundedness. Yeah, so these groups are implica, yeah, 50 something. Yeah? And so that's for some units the normal, with the unstressed syllables, and for very worse, that's the construct status. So that we can bound together to yeah. So that's the most simple indication.
Yeah, I think let's take a break for coffee, and then we'll come back at 3:30. Yeah, and there is fresh coffee outside. I saw him bringing it in, so don't drink that. That's cold. There should be some. I don't know how fresh it is. He's been arriving early, so but it's somewhat fresh. It's better than that, so it's okay. Yeah.
You guys are back.
On your page, you might help some users by indicating how large